Today we are going to see an important topic where many of my friends and my students were asking what is the difference between API and API gateway, because I develop an API and I connect to the API. Should I use API gateway? What is the key difference between API gateway? So we're going to see that in today's presentation. And also API play a critical role in connecting the systems and enabling the data exchanges between the application. So we're going to touch upon it and what exactly APIs are and how they differ from API gateway. I hope this session will help many of you to understand what is API and what is API gateway. Let's move on. A API gateway is nothing but application programming interface. So when we say application programming interface, an application is nothing but a program or code which you write in JavaScript, Python, Node.js, AngularJS, and you actually make that application as an interface, like to connect to the another application. We will see detail upon it. It is set of rules and protocols that allows one application to interact with another application. We also call API contract. What does contract means? Rules, how you have to use my application. So API also sets protocol rules and protocol. API defines the method and data format that applications can use to communicate each other. What is the methods? API methods are get, put, post, no, delete. So with if you want to add a data or get a data from another application, you will use get method. And there are certain format like JSON where the application responds back. So here you need to understand very simple. API is nothing but the interface you create on your application for the other applications to access it. And the same way, if you want to access some other application like Google Maps or Weather API or some other application, you can use the interface of that application to have Google Map into your application. Right now, if you are using Ola, Uber, you can see there was a map where it shows where are you with GPS tracker. So actually that maps come from Google. They don't develop a map. They use the map service of Google into the Ola application. How it happens is via application programming interface, which is API. Now, when we see API gateway is nothing but a server or service that act as in front of API request. So basically you have an API, in front of your API you are adding API gateway. So what it does, enforcing throttling and security policies, passing the request to the backend service and then passing the response back to the requester. Basically API gateway, as the word says, is gateway. It acts in front of your API to enhance security, and we will see what are the other things, logging and monitoring, and what are the other things it provides. Basically it passes the request to your API and your API responses it. It sends the response back to the whoever is sending the request to your API gateway. I hope now you are clear. API and API gateway are two different components. API is your actual interface of your application, and API gateway will act in front of your API to serve the request. The key differences in functionality are API provides specific functionality or data access for your application. It provides access. API gateway acts as a gatekeeper, managing and routing your request to multiple APIs or services. So as I said, it is a gatekeeper. It manages your API and route the request. Single versus multiple. API represents a single endpoint or service, but gateway represents multiple APIs or service under single domain or gate endpoint. So if your endpoint is like www.cloudhobby.com, the endpoints can be multiple. Create course, look into course might be one endpoint, one API. Second API is pay fees. Third API. So with one endpoint, you can have multiple API slugs. I hope you are getting little bit between the difference. Security and authentication is another key difference, where often security mechanism and authentication is needed for the API, which API gateway provides. In terms of API, it has its own security mechanism, which is authentication, but API gateway provides centralized security feature like authentication, authorization, encryption for your APIs. Rate limiting. Rate limiting may be implemented individually for each API. What is rate limiting? If someone tries to hit your API for more than 10 times, 100 times, 1000 times, we want to stop the request. Basically, it is a traffic. We want to stop the traffic. That is the rate limiting feature. API gateway can enforce rate limiting and traffic management across all the APIs it manages. So you don't need to have rate limiting for each and every API you have, whereas API gateway centrally manage the rate limiting policy. Logging and monitoring. So API, you have to write your own logging and monitoring for API, each API with the Loggator or whatever programming like package you use. But API gateway offers centralized logging and monitoring for all the APIs it controls, simplify and analysis and troubleshooting, which is very fair, right? We for deployments we use in cloud, we use cloud monitoring system. So making a centralized solution rather than every time you create an API, you need to add a feature to that API. You just create an API and API gateway take care of it. Versioning. You need to version every API endpoint, but API gateway can handling versioning transparently, routing requests to the correct API. If I have the two API, same API with two versions, v3, v4 or v2, v3, API gateway send certain requests to v2, certain requests to v3, depend on the customer. So the handling the versioning API gateway does. Otherwise, you need to have certain manual or customized solution in front of your APIs. This will also help in blue-green deployment or rolling. If you have a certain new feature which you need to expose to certain customers, then you can do that in the rolling deployment. Let's see some use cases. API typically uses for exposing certain functionalities of your application or data points, often consumed by developers building the applications. So it's very clear. Like if you are developing an application and you want to get functionality of other application, you use the API to develop it. So that's what they have done. Whereas in API gateway, ideal for managing complex microservices architecture. Microservices is nothing but you have an application where it will be split into 4 different applications and running into your infrastructure, and all these microservices interact with each other with the APIs. So provides a single entry point for all API traffic, enhance security and control. So whereas you have Flipkart, where you go and see the catalog, you have payment after you select the product. So these two will be 2 different applications entirely, even though you see as one application. And how these 2 application talks, when you select the product from the catalog, when you actually go and click the payment, there will be API call. So this all has been managed centrally by one entry point, which is from the API gateway. Conclusion is APIs and API gateway are both crucial component where you use both. It's not like that you use API not the API gateway or API gateway not the API, because API gateway are actually meant to for APIs. So in every company or every product you work with APIs, API gateway will be the crucial component. APIs provide specific functionality while API gateways manage it, and manage it while security and optimize API traffic. The choices between 2 dependent application needs and complexity. If you have just one API, 2 API, just having an API gateway in front of it may not make sense. You can go with your API with all the monitoring you need. But over the time, the APIs will grow. You will make more API products when we make more microservices. Then it's actually having an API gateway is easy to manage. I hope it's very clear what API and API gateway does, and I'm open to any questions. If you have any questions related to API and API gateway, please do comment on it. I just took 10 minutes to explain you on API and API gateway. There might be a lot more things which I may not cover it, but please do feel free to ask questions. Thank you guys. Enjoy. Have a nice day.